Hey y'all, you know we're a nonprofit, right? That means we rely on donations from listeners to keep this podcast going. So if you have a couple of dollars to spare, because every dollar counts, please consider giving at patreon.com/femfreak. Also, fun fact, in addition to the perks that you'll get as a Patreon subscriber, your donations and contributions on Patreon are also tax deductible because we're a 501c3. So if you want to learn more, if you want to give, please head over to patreon.com/femfreak.
Although the Hays Code did succeed in kind of creating a fake national morality that was a lot more middle of the road than the coastal entertainment cultures, it couldn't completely heal the breach between North and South around representations of race.
Welcome to Feminist Frequency Radio. This is the show that asks you to be critical of the media you love. I'm Anita Sarkeesian, and this season of the podcast, along with my co-host, Kat Spada, we're using each episode to take a look at the history of Hollywood through the decades.
Bree Daniels?
What the hell is going on here?
Are you going to take Johnny away from me?
Take a nap, because you're going to need all your energy tonight.
Silly boy.
Today, we're joined by Patricia White, Centennial Professor of Film and Media Studies and Coordinator of Gender and Sexuality Studies at Swarthmore College. Man, academics have the longest titles. Patricia's books include a study of Hitchcock's Rebecca in the BFI Film Classics series, Women's Cinema, World Cinema, Projecting Contemporary Feminisms, and Uninvited, Classical Hollywood Cinema and Lesbian Representability.
Everyone does that, Anita.
It's a lot. It's a mouthful.
I learned to be more succinct in my titles as I matured.
Patricia is on the board of directors of Women Make Movies and a member of the editorial collective of the Feminist Journal of Media and Culture, Camera Obscura. And she's going to usher us through Hollywood in the 1930s, a decade marked by economic hardship and the rise of fascism, and with a film landscape remembered for classic monster movies like Frankenstein, blockbuster epics like Gone with the Wind, and technicolor fantasies like The Wizard of Oz. Patricia.
Hi, Patricia.
Hi.
Thank you for having me. And I want to say that I'm here to love the movies that I'm critical of.
Yes. That's our favorite part.
So first of all, I have a question from looking at your bio. I saw that you got your PhD in the history of consciousness, and I'm very curious what that means.
The History of Consciousness program is at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and it's, a little bit woo-woo because it's Santa Cruz, but it actually started in the 60s. It's sort of the legacy of the kind of radical work of Herbert Marcuse and Norman O. Brown, and the program came together around scholars doing work cross-disciplinarily, and at the time that I went there, they had recently hired Teresa de Loretas, who was a feminist film theorist and semiotician, and she was going to join Donna Haraway, famous for her Cyborg Manifesto essay, and other scholars, Hayden White, in the program. So I sort of followed her there and did my work in this context that only got better because Angela Davis then joined the program. And it had its heyday. It's still happening. But there at the time, it was just these really incredible senior scholars. And it has over the years, had to figure out ways to sort of reproduce that magic. I was really interested in film and feminist theory, and they kind of bloomed together in that program.
Nice. I almost applied to that program. I was on my short list of, because when you're like doing really well in school and you're like you get to hang out with all these people and think all these big thinky thoughts, you're like, I'm just going to be in school forever. Why not go to the History of Consciousness? So then I went to Social and Political Thought, which is equally as obscure
in Stanford?
and useless, really. No, God, no. I went to York
York,
University in Toronto.
yeah. Well, still such a great program there. Yeah.
It's another one of those, like, this doesn't really mean anything. You just kind of come in and make your own program to some degree. So
I think it was at a moment when theory was really, the word in the humanities. And it was right because it was kind of, transgressing disciplinary boundaries, but it also had a little bit of scared off some people. It was a little elitist to be like, we do theory. And that was part of what I think feminism was.
And, there's a lot of like radical leftist thought in a lot of these spaces that was obviously very appealing to me and others. Yeah. But so, okay, we're here to talk about the 30s, which is a fascinating time in Hollywood. So can you tell us about what's going on? Like it's, people say it's the golden age. What does that even mean? Like people talk about the studio system, but like, we still have studios, so how was it different then? And I think maybe the biggest question is how the Hays Code and what the Hays Code is and how that interfered with all of this.
Right. Well, the 30s was a heyday for, cinema going and for the kind of organization of the industry in Hollywood in a really stable way. The studios had their own stable of stars. They had their own, sound stages and production facilities. They had their own theaters. So they were really vertically integrated, as the language goes for the antitrust people that would come later. This was really the case already in the 20s, and the star system was, really going. The production was centered in Southern California, but the difference between the 30s and the 20s was sound. And a lot of the economic fallout from World War I and in that affected international film production and the distribution of Hollywood films. So there was a lot of kind of bumpy transition right at the end of the 20s, but Hollywood sort of landed on its feet by rapidly incorporating sound and making new stars in the new medium, some of them singing stars, some of them, risque European ones that kind of made up for the kind of hit that European film industries took during this period of economic it's chaos really everywhere. So the US is in the Depression, but in the beginning of the 30s is able to kind of make the Hollywood dream factory kind of absorb all of the anxiety about upward mobility by making movies about it and getting people to come every week. So you referred to the Hays Code, and this is written by William Hays, who was a postmaster general at one point, or it's overseen by him. And it's really part of the industry's effort not to be regulated by the government. So in many ways, economically, and here in terms of free speech, the movies weren't actually considered protected speech. They could be, targeted for influencing people unduly for any number of things. And the industry was really eager to keep that in-house, to keep the regulation in-house. So they came up with a code, which was largely drafted by Catholics. And they agreed that they would abide by it. For the first 4 years of the 1930s, they barely did. They gave lip service to complying with this list of do's and don'ts and things that could not be represented and things that we're like familiar with today, like, no images of toilets or married couples sleep in separate beds. And I guess overall, the idea that
no images of toilets,
no pictures of
really?
toilets. Well, that was one of the. I don't know that it's said that exactly explicitly, but they did have to send pictures of sets to the Production Code Administration, which was instituted by 1934, to approve the sort of, décolleté of women's gowns and the way that beds were arrayed. And by 1960, when we still have the Production Code in place, Hitchcock's Psycho, which has a very prominent picture of a toilet when Marion Crane flushes for her accounting for the stolen money that she's taken with her to the Bates Motel. When she flushes that down, there's like this close up. So that was one of the tacky things that this film did, way ahead in the 1960s. But back in the 30s, a lot happened with the coming of sound. And as I said, with some of the more lenient morals of Europe. So a lot of directors came from Europe and stars came from Europe. And a lot of the films were really full of double entendre or almost explicit about their sexual content. And one of the big sort of storylines of the period was that of the gold digger, the woman who, was kind of let loose from her middle American life and into the big city to earn her living. And all of a sudden depression comes and she has to find a way to, keep afloat and hitches her wagon to some wealthy man. So there are a lot of these kind of gold digger movies that were pretty explicit about how these women, were kept. So there was more and more outcry from the moral forces to start enforcing the production code. And then, as I said, by 1934, you have the code administration and a much more regulated process for sending in scripts back and forth with the censors. Joe Breen was the head of the PCA, about what lines needed to be taken out, what outcomes needed to be changed. And the biggest kind of thrust of the production code, no pun intended, was that people had to pay for their indiscretions, for their transgressions. So you could have some sympathy for a villain, but by the end, everything had to be put right. So, the bad guys got their downfall and the good guys were rewarded. And you kind of can't underestimate how much that informs a particularly American way of being naive and hypocritical about how the world works, right? It's all going to be okay in the end. And that, stayed in place for a long time. I'm so
fascinated by the production code. I like it. It keeps coming up in all of these conversations, partly because it's been around for almost a huge history of Hollywood in general. But when we were in the first episode with Shelley Stamp about the 10s and 20s, we talked a little bit about there's different censorship bodies in different states, and they would regulate totally differently and have different rules. And so we talked about Lois Weber and how a lot of her films were censored. I thought it was interesting because one of her films had a massive outcry because there was the naked truth in one of her most popular films, Hypocrites, where the woman is probably wearing a body stocking, but she looks naked. And so when we'll get to talking about Blonde Venus, but I was like, those women are fully fucking naked.
Maybe body stockings, who knows, right?
Yeah, but it was just really interesting to me about both how fairly quickly culture changes to accept different norms, but also how the Hays Code, both was a way to get the government off of the industry's back. And it caused so much, I feel like it caused a lot of harm to the industry in general in terms of how stories are told and what stories are told, both in exactly what you're saying of how the media shapes our understanding of the world. I grew up thinking that in the 50s, couples would sleep in separate beds, even though my parents didn't. And not because it's true, but because the media makes things feel true, right? And so how much that is influenced, but also I think the flip side of it is how the constraint created so much creativity in some of the ways that we tell stories, or some of the ways that these filmmakers try to insert more, subversive aspects to their stories.
Absolutely. And I think that's really what's so fascinating about the 1930s, which really, there were pretty violent genres. There's gangster films, but there were also a lot of films centered around female stars and aimed toward female audiences, or at least to the concept that the female audience decided what movies people would see. So there really was a kind of putting front and center of female glamour and the desirability of these stars for everyone. So a star like Marlene Dietrich is imported from Germany and billed as, the woman all women want to see, right? And of course, it's, she's supposed to be sexy and a little bit of a top, and she's, kind of being German and very knowledgeable in the ways of the world from her cabaret background, but it's really billed towards female audiences. So her work, and you allude to Blonde Venus, which comes out in 1932. Almost all of her films, 6 of her films, are directed by Josef von Sternberg, who comes to Hollywood with her. They were master and mistress of avoiding the sanctions of the code with creative, oblique storytelling and innuendo. So, for example, in Blonde Venus, a film in which Marlene Dietrich is very badly behaved. She has extramarital sex. She flirts with women in the cabaret. She goes off on her own and crosses racial lines in the American South. But all of it's kind of excused because she's doing it for her child. So one of the major frames for female transgression and this popular genre of the fallen woman was that she would have a baby, and the baby she'd have to sort of sacrifice for the baby. So she would be punished through her sacrifice and ennobled by that sacrifice. So you could still, root for her because she was a mom as well as a sexually transgressive female. And then
I think
go ahead.
It's interesting to me that thinking about the Hays Code, which I didn't realize lasted as long as it did, even though I'm familiar with on I Dream of Jeannie, they couldn't show belly buttons. Like that sort of thing was definitely still existing, but I didn't realize how much of a part of the industry it might have been. We still have with the rating system. I mean, you can tell pretty much any type of thing. You might just not get passed through the rating system. The kind of qualification of certain types of explicit action or imagery. So, for example, in a PG-13 movie, you can say the F word once, but not if it's in a sexual context. So it's like, it's not that the word itself is what's off limits, it's how it's being used. Or nudity, there's different types of nudity. Is it nudity that comes with violence? Is it sexuality that's queer? Is it sexuality that involves people of color? Like these things all have different shades within how the ratings
notoriously
govern them.
Notoriously male and female nudity, where full frontal male nudity is such a scandal, right? So you were so the production code in Hollywood is in place until like 1967. It's weakened considerably. But the year after that, 1968, an X-rated film wins Best Picture, Midnight Cowboy. So they hadn't settled into what exactly was, going to be the line that was drawn after the rating system and after the code was thrown out.
Can we talk a little bit about the studio system? I think it's really interesting that this is a time in which actors and directors were like attached to a studio and they didn't work anywhere else unless their contract was bought out, right? So today, everybody is sort of a free agent. I mean, you can sign, terms and right of first refusal and all of that. But it seems like a very different energy to be attached to a studio in this way, like being owned by a studio.
Right. And that's some of the biggest issues in the 1930s, which was like the best pro-labor moment in American history with the National Recovery Act and FDR's administration. women, other stars, but at the head of them were people like Betty Davis, were objecting to the contractual obligation. She was at Warner Brothers, and she didn't want to play in certain films, and she was forced to, or she was asked to, work for a different studio. And if she didn't want to do it, she was put on unpaid leave. So it was a very fraught.
You could be rented out to other studios. Am I remembering that correctly?
Yeah. So it really was quite like, bartering in people. I'll give you, this star for this director. So that was another. So the studio systems, as I said, were really kind of all powerful in the studios. There were 5 major studios that were kind of all powerful in the 1930s. And then some smaller ones that, made sort of B movies or tried to have a kind of independent production model. And so Samuel Goldwyn and eventually David O. Selznick had their own production companies, but they really functioned like studios with, sound stages and most of the and kind of regular relationships with writers and stars. So just to get back to the Blonde Venus example, that movie was made at Paramount. That's where Dietrich and von Sternberg landed, partly as a counter move to MGM's importing of Greta Garbo. And Garbo had been very successful in the silent period. And Dietrich was launched at a moment when they were trying to figure out what to do with sound. So her film, Blonde Venus, was actually filmed in French, English, and German versions. So there was this moment of thinking about, and I think that her cosmopolitan sexuality had something to do with that. But quickly that became unrealistic. And she was kind of molded to both, carry this European allure and rival Garbo in that, and to somehow be domesticated. So if you look at the film Blonde Venus, you mentioned, Anita, the opening segment where there's these nymphs swimming in a pond in Germany, basically. It's the sort of fairy tale that Marlene Dietrich's character tells her little boy about how she met his dad, an American sort of science student. But that opening segment wasn't circulated with the film after the production code came into play. So it could just be kind of lopped off. And so I remember seeing the film without that. So I was really shocked to see these like naked ladies swimming in this, alpine lake. And then of course there's other sinister dimensions of that, which would be like Southern exhibitors could cut out a musical number featuring a Black performer because they were sort of filmed in order to allow for that. The code.
Was that a part of the Hays Code, or was that a separate
thing? The Hays Code did have certain regulations around race, notably prohibiting miscegenation, so interracial relationships. And although the Hays Code did succeed in kind of creating a fake national morality that was a lot more middle of the road than, the coastal entertainment cultures of New York and Los Angeles, it couldn't completely heal or the breach between North and South around representations of race. So that lasted for a really long time of just being able to clip out Lena Horne's musical number. But in terms of the kind of studio identities, each one of the studios had their own kind of brand, and some of them were more willing to deal with sort of social problem questions than others. So in some ways, MGM, which was the most powerful, really was the most normalizing in its morality. You see Andy Hardy and played by Mickey Rooney and Judy Garland as, his sidekick love interest. And that's like this, really generic idea of saccharine, pure morality. So one of the other dimensions of the stability of the studio system and the fact that they had stars under contract was that they used other elements of their stable of employees to enforce a certain look. So, for example, all of Dietrich's costumes were designed by Travis Banton, and they looked different than the costumes designed for Greta Garbo at MGM by Cedric Gibbons. So there was a real nurturing of craft, and in some ways, the stability of the studio system helped for people like, people in costume or set design, editors, directors, to kind of hone their craft, and you have very high production values because the studios always had money coming in from the theaters that they owned, and their well honed formula for genres and cycles. So that's why it's called the Golden Age, because you really do have what the film critic Andre Bazin called the genius of the system. It wasn't necessarily an individual genius, although of course there were those, but this kind of well-oiled capitalist machine really did make for, that other phrase that Hollywood of the period's known as the dream factory.
So what the Gilded Age did for consolidation of rail industry 50 years prior, basically, and how there's companies, these one man would just own a dozen companies that were all feeding profits into each other. We have this happening in Hollywood. So I have a few other titles I'm going to want to ask you about, but why don't I just give our listeners a little overview of the two movies that we watched on your recommendation to give us a touch point into this decade. So we've talked about Blonde Venus, which is a 1932 film that I read was based on an original story Marlene Dietrich herself wrote. And we also watched 1937's Stella Dallas, starring Barbara Stanwyck and Anne Shirley. In Blonde Venus, Dietrich plays an actress, if you can't hear my air quotes there, and singer who returns to the stage to earn enough money to pay for her sick husband, a scientist suffering from terminal radium poisoning, to seek treatment in Germany. While separated, she takes up with a handsome patron, played by Cary Grant, which sends her down a path of ruin and redemption. In Stella Dallas, 5 years later, we watch the story of a woman who sacrifices her own wants and desires so that her teenage daughter Laurel can live a better life among the wealth and society of Stella's ex-husband, who is reunited with his first love, a widow who could offer Laurel class and access beyond her wildest dreams. I took 1,000 notes about Blonde Venus and not that many notes about Stella Dallas, although it was, I loved Barbara Stanwyck in it. It was beautiful to watch her perform, but let's, I'm curious, these definitely, as you alluded to, seemed like a bit of a before and after. Before and after it happened one night, before and after Hollywood was letting these things be seen. And it's very clear what the ramifications of Stella's immoralities are in the film Stella Dallas, 1937. Whereas in 1932, our character of Helen Faraday has the opportunity to kind of rebuild her life by her, according to her own terms, for the most part. But I wanted specifically to ask, maybe we can jump off from here. I put those air quotes around actress and singer. We see her on stage singing. She's definitely a performer, but it seemed so obvious to me that the reason her husband wouldn't want her to go back to that life is because she was basically an escort. I mean, is that something that I shouldn't have inferred from this movie?
Absolutely not. It's clear. There's a dissolve from a moment in the film when it's clear that Helen is going to take up with Cary Grant and let him kind of be her patron, and a check that he writes to her, and that ostensibly is forwarded to her husband for his treatment. So the negotiations with the production code tried to downplay a little bit the explicitness of her being a kept woman, and the solution that von Sternberg came up with, which is a visual one. Just get rid of all of the, script that tried to explain it away, and just kind of let us infer what that relationship is. So we have this, there's a check being written, and then there's a montage of them doing glamorous things like zooming around on a yacht, lounging languidly in a beautiful Art Deco apartment. So we do. I don't think there's any mistaking that she's essentially a high-class prostitute.
Yeah, there's an oblique threat of maybe he'd want to marry her. That seems sort of artificially put in there.
And it's interesting because, of course, the chemistry between a young Cary Grant and Marlene Dietrich is a lot more, compelling than that with her husband, played by Herbert Marshall. And she's, shown being a hausfrau at the beginning of the film. I mean, it's a very intensely lit, tiny New York apartment with like the bathtub in the kitchen. But she's going to bust out of it by the kind of stylization that von Sternberg brings to the lighting, and her and the way she's shot.
At the I hear you on the chemistry between her and Cary Grant, because at the end when she's like, it's kind of clear that she's going back to her husband or whatever. You're like, no, why would you do that? I don't understand. This is a terrible idea.
And I think that just like the beginning of the film is set in this weird place, like, this lake with these chorus girls. The end of the film, it's surreal. She's wearing this incredibly glamorous gown, and she goes and puts her little baby boy to bed. And it's very oniric, dreamlike. And it's almost like if she recites this script, that, mom and dad are going to get back together, and the child's, dream of his mother will, be restored. But it's not convincing. It's not convincing at all. It's really like movie magic. It's this, sort of succumbing to the glamour of Marlene Dietrich. And then the next von Sternberg film would kind of pick up on that same fantasy, just put it somewhere else. Now she's, the Scarlet Empress, Catherine the Great, or now she's, Shanghai Lily in Shanghai Express. So it's really the star discourse, and again, costume, lighting, the way she's styled.
The costuming she looked amazing.
Yeah.
Like, I feel like this movie is worth watching just for all of the exquisite outfits. And honestly, I kept being like, man, I wish I could see the color. Like, not that I mind the black and white, but also in Stella Dallas, they kept talking about the blues and like the colors of their outfits, and I was like, I want to see these costumes in full color. One of the things that I found extremely disorienting was representations of race in both of these movies. Partially because I think contemporary films don't there's absolutely racism in contemporary films, but it feels different than in these. So I watched Stella Dallas first, and just the sort of mammy housekeeper, Black woman character, it kind of jarred me out of the story. And then also in Blonde Venus, you have a Black bartender who has a really kind of ludicrous stutter, and I was like, I don't know what you're trying to do with this. And then you have this horrific extended performance of Black sexualized women in chains, and then these kind of like tiki informed sort of savage face masks, and you're like, and a gorilla like walking around with all of them, and you're just, it goes on and on and on, and you're like, holy fuck. And then all of a sudden Marlene Dietrich comes out of the gorilla costume. It's like a fever dream. It's like an extremely racist fever dream, and it was very jarring. And then I guess another example too is towards the end of Blonde Venus, you have a woman of color, I think she was a Black woman, helping her, right? Being like, there's this cop on the street, let me go find out what he wants, and like being her sort of support character. And it was hard. It was hard to watch it.
She has that Black woman and a kind of coded butch, like this other woman who's got a child of her own, and both of them are very quick to understand you're trying to get away from a husband, and I know how to help.
Yeah, and I totally understand the shock of seeing these things, but I think in some ways the 30s were richer in the ways that they deconstructed some of the racial imaginary of America than would later be the case when in the 40s, when the stars who were playing these roles and were able to kind of put their own first of all, virtuosity as performers, sometimes if it's dancing or just comic acting, like with Hattie McDaniel, into them. But also, they at least stood for this other place that was at odds with the white world. And the imagination of the 40s, when the idea of, integrating the military, integrating factories, was given, lip service, but there wasn't real equality, made for movies that were a little more dishonest about racial hierarchies and again, the racial imaginary. So the hot voodoo sequence that you describe, and you describe very well, which is an astonishing performance by Dietrich, is at least about racial taboos. It's an equation of the white woman. She's called Blonde Venus because race has to be explicitly acknowledged, where it isn't in many, many other Hollywood films. She's, what's the contrast? Her sexuality is conflated with these fantasies of African and African American sexual promiscuity and potency. And she will later cross-dress. It's obligatory for Dietrich to cross-dress after the top hat that she wears in Blue Angel, and the tuxedo that she wears in order to kiss a woman in the audience in Morocco. But before she cross-dresses and transgresses the boundary of male-female, she transgresses the boundary of human-beast. And that's kind of kinky, as much as it is shocking. And pointing out that she has these, first of all, this circle of chorus girls around her in the first number, and then women who help her as she descends deeper and deeper into poverty when she flees with her son, is part of, I think, the queer connotations of Dietrich's performance and persona, so that when she ends up she's either in Galveston or in New Orleans, when Hattie McDaniel, who was, already very well established as an actor in Hollywood, is her lookout. There is a kind of, I don't want to go overboard and say that it's equality. It isn't, but there's an intimacy between them and a kind of recognition of their outsider status that I think comes across in the performance if you are willing to kind of reconstruct the codes of the racial imaginary of the 1930s that informed the film. As a one-off, yeah, it's pretty crazy. But I do think that there's something that, the Black maids that were always Mae West's confidants in the films of the same period also kind of hinted at this place where there was a less uptight morality, more easily transgressed homo-hetero boundaries along with racial boundaries.
You mentioned the sort of queer connotations. I didn't see them.
Yeah.
I was just wondering if Kat,
this is me okay, so I wrote this book called Uninvited Classical Hollywood Cinema and Lesbian Representability. And the word is, as you notice, hard to say. And the idea was, could you imagine, if you couldn't represent queerness, what were the conditions for its representability? And one of them would be mise en scène, like cabarets or the women's boarding house, where or the prostitute clip joint where Dietrich's hanging out and Hattie McDaniel's, which is in the wrong side of town, is in a Black neighborhood. All of those kind of very fleeting references to outside spaces could connote queerness. And I don't think that they were necessarily written to do that. But my contention is that the worlds that these glamorous stars were inhabiting in 1930s and 1940s films, because during the 40s, the audience was perceived as even more female because the men were at war. These worlds are kind of female worlds. And to me, there is some erotic potential. I mean, how can you exclude eroticism when you have a star like Dietrich?
Yeah. I think that a big part of what carried me to seeing the queerness is the star power. So it's like maybe this is a weird modern analogy, but like Rachel Weisz, who, as far as we know, is a straight woman, I think is like queer coded, and a lot of the, she's been played in queer roles and has this little bit of iconic status nowadays. So I know if I'm going to see a Marlene Dietrich movie, I'm going to picture this woman who wears a top hat and tails. And there were certainly a couple of flirtatious moments, at the very least, where she, grazes the cheek of one of the dancers, or kind of sidles up to an audience member right after she does the same thing to Cary Grant. And that, again, like I couldn't watch this without having the Marlene Dietrich of lore in my mind, but
and of the other movies. So the fact that she kisses a woman in Morocco is very fresh to audiences who then see her in this white tie and tails, caressing the Parisian chorus girl who clearly must know a lot about sexuality. I do think that the cross race and cross class quote unquote queerness, or the incestuous mother-daughter queerness that I would say you find in some of these movies is harder to convince people of. But I kind of think that some of the ways that Hollywood had to avoid representing heterosexuality left for a lot more homosociality in women's pictures that, I tend to find intriguing. So, for example, in Stella Dallas, spoilers, the only way that Stella can not ruin her daughter's life with her own, inborn tackiness as a working class person is to give up the daughter to this other woman, her husband's former flame, and after the divorce, his new wife. And she does this in the most strange, flirty, weird scene where she pretends that she can't take care of Laurel anymore. And the other woman pretends that she believes her, and they get closer and closer on this couch until their mutual understanding as mothers puts them in this physical proximity that I think is just, it's kind of lesbian,
and it's a transference of like I'm physically sending my maternal power to you.
Right. And maternal energy is like the strongest thing that these women have going with the prohibitions on sexuality. So there's some stuff going on. And then she gets into bed, like her daughter climbs into bed with her in order to comfort her when she knows that her mom has heard some, fancy people making fun of her working class ways. Their bond is so romanticized, and that I think the feminist critics who kind of rediscovered Stella Dallas and said, yeah, it looks like a terrible message of maternal sacrifice. You don't get to have anything of your own. You just kind of fade off into the distance. And, after you launch your daughter into this quite boring middle-class world, those feminist critics said, you know what, the affect, the emotion, the power, the sentiment, the tears, the understanding, the immediacy, the transparency, all of that's going on between mothers and daughters and mothers about daughters is at least part of a, feminist or, a feminist grasp of the immensity and importance of women's relationships to each other.
I was thinking about class. Both of these films are deeply rooted in class struggle. And I feel like a bunch of the films from like the older films that we're watching have a really explicit class conversations. And we don't have that as much these days. So I think that talking about class in contemporary media is pretty rare in the same way. And so, but I'm also, I don't know if it's just because I'm like, cherry picking films from the 20s, 30s, and 40s. It just feels like the big hits are more rooted in that. And maybe it's because of the Depression, maybe it's because of the time, but that class was a type of oppression that that films and the mainstream were completely prepared to talk about openly in a way that we struggle to, I think, over the last couple of decades in our contemporary time. And so I think there's something really interesting here about the fact that like Stella Dallas is all about this woman who is trying to move up in rank, right? Move up in class, and is committed to doing it and then fails, right? Like she just can't be as, like she's trying so hard and she just can't be as accepted as she would like to be, right?
Well, and it seems that these two movies are maybe more in touch with the reality that the audience might have been experiencing during the Depression. Like I don't think of these types of movies when I casually think of the 30s. I think of, Gone with the Wind, the big fantasy, or Footlight Parade, which is like a Busby Berkeley spectacle of just ridiculous onstage vaudeville choreography. I love that movie. It's absurd. But these movies, I really thought, oh, this is probably a lot more relatable, even though there's still caricatures in a lot of ways, but maybe class is a conversation more audience members were willing to engage with in the 30s.
I think so. I think both of your comments are so important. The 30s, it depends on the studio, But it also was a time when class was discussed, and because of the Depression, because of the New Deal. So even Busby Berkeley escapist numbers, if you look at 42nd Street, there's a song called We're in the Money that is all about, we're never going to see a bread line again. And then at the end of the number, the Broadway show that they're trying to put on gets shut down because they don't have enough money. So Warner Brothers, where those musicals were made, was really the more class conscious. And I think that this gets less notable in the 1940s, but you also have stars like Joan Crawford and Barbara Stanwyck who carry their working class background into sometimes storylines in which they have like this great rise to riches, usually sleeping their way to the top, or play mothers whose class status is ennobled by either their work, like in Mildred Pierce, or in this case, their sacrifice. So I do think even though the Barbara Stanwyck character in Stella Dallas, and this was, written by Olive Higgins Prouty, who also wrote the novel for Now Voyager and some of the big women's pictures. And Stella Dallas was made as a film already in the 20s, but would become a really long-running radio serial. That kind of identification with that struggle to have her desire, like to be who she wants to be, like she wants to be a good time girl, and she doesn't really like bourgeois propriety. In some ways, she holds on to that, even though it means, she can't keep Laurel. So I think there are powerful echoes of social realities and of kind of American ideas about class that, I'm not thinking of a star that has that quite in the same way at the moment. Maybe you can think of one, but celebrity is so different. And
and I also think as a society, we think about class differently and we try to hide it. I'd say the last couple of years, there's been a much bigger conversation about who owns all the wealth and like the sort of tech moguls that have taken over. But there's a whole stretch, I'd say, like between Reagan and like the mid 2000s, where it's just, we don't talk about class and we don't acknowledge it. And there's the whole kind of like, the bootstraps mentality of like, just you're only poor because you're not working hard enough, and all that. And really, in the middle of that, there was like Occupy and everything. But I think for the most part, as a society and media, we've really pushed away from discussions of class, and our media, and we've seen that like in the media, that there's just no conversation about it. And, it's kind of the joke about how New York City apartments are enormous. And we all look at those shows and we're like, that's not real. You don't work at the diner and live in that apartment. And, like part of it is because of constraints of filming and like size of like equipment in a room. But I think there's a bigger issue about the fact that we have erased conversations of class, or the Republicans and the conservatives have created a mythology around how working class folks can aspire to greatness, and so therefore vote for and support all of these wealthy people because that could be you one day, right? And so that's erased genuine, sincere conversations. I think also there's the rise of the middle class is another part of this conversation too, of like the erasure of discussion of class as everyone was sort of trying to get into this sort of sweet spot. But whatever, that's...
I think a lot of the Hollywood mythology of the studio system really helped to do that. This kind of fantasy of a classless, accentless, colorless middle America, where you could talk about relationships and love affairs instead of, like class divides.
And I would say this is part of why when Roseanne, I know Roseanne's a huge, massive, horrible person now, but when Roseanne came out in the late 80s, early 90s, was a huge deal because we weren't talking about class that explicitly in television. We weren't talking about women and like poor women and like mothers and in a way that was sympathetic to them, right? Sorry,
well,
an example I thought of.
The person that I have been thinking of since we started having this part of the conversation is, of all people, Julia Roberts. But in Mystic Pizza, Pretty Woman, and Erin Brockovich, she is this unbelievably gorgeous woman who is working class or a sex worker on the street. Like that is kind of maybe what her beginnings of being America's sweetheart was. And then a few years later to play basically movie star Julia Roberts in like Notting Hill and the Ocean's movies, I feel like is sort of an acknowledgement of like, we know she's a big Hollywood star. Like it's cute that we said she was this woman for a while. And that's I think how Hollywood kind of brushes over it, is like they'll put Charlize Theron in a movie that a few decades prior it might have been like Sally Field, who was a more relatable kind of person for people to see in Norma Ray. And I think about, I think Barbara Stanwyck is you can't look away from her. She has this magnetism, but I gather that she was coded as like kind of a plainer faced woman than a lot of the other stars. Marlene Dietrich is this exotic beauty from Germany, and there's like
I actually looked up because I haven't seen any. I don't think I've seen any other Marlene Dietrich or Barbara Stanwyck films, and I actually Googled like headshots of Barbara Stanwyck because I'm like, isn't she supposed to be beautiful? Like she just doesn't in this movie doesn't have that sort of glamorous look, and in the photos I looked up, I'm like, oh yeah, that looks like the glitzy, glamoury, whatever. But she doesn't have the same. She doesn't have the same like unreal look that we think of as celebrity at this time, right?
No, and I think that's super important with Stanwyck. I mean, even her voice. So you mentioned Kat, the screwball comedies that maybe we think of more as the 30s, and Stanwyck was fantastic in screwball comedies, but she played like a card shark or a cabaret girl in Ball of Fire. And I think that her kind of versatility in taking these, and then she also was in one of the notorious, Sleeping Her Way to the Top movies of the early 30s, Babyface, where I think that's one where she like literally sleeps her way to the top. Like there's a scene where you see her going up on every floor of this building to reach the penthouse. So for one thing, that she was a star that people identified with, and there's no arguing that Stella Dallas is a woman's picture for a female audience to watch. So I think that combination of her actual class background, her force of personality over kind of, artifice in terms of the constructed appearance. And yeah, these 30s narratives where you just needed chutzpah, make her a really progressive star. The other, stars of the period, like talk about class, like Katharine Hepburn, was, benefiting a little bit from the sort of sexual ambiguity. She plays kind of butch characters in certain roles, but she does that at the cost of, she's not she's definitely an upper class patrician New England kind of figure.
Yeah, I would like to say that I get a little bit of trepidation when I have to watch older movies because I just like have in my mind that they're really boring and stuffy and slow and hard to get through. And so I sort of waited till the last minute to watch these, and they're actually really good. Like they're fun and interesting, and their pacing isn't as excruciating as I think that some older films can be, or that we think of as sometimes think of as old movies, quote unquote. So if this conversation was interesting to you, I encourage you to watch both of these films. I think Blonde Venus is far more, Marlene Dietrich and her outfits are just so captivating. But they're both really interesting. Blonde Venus was a little bit harder to find, but I did find a link on Internet Archive that was available to stream for free. So I would check that out. And then I think Stella Dallas was on Amazon Prime at the time of this recording. So I encourage you all to check out these films and learn more about Hollywood history. Patricia, thank you so much for joining us. This was amazing.
Thank you.
Is there anything you want to plug? Are you on social media? You got anything you working on that you want to share?
I think that I would probably just say check out the British Film Institute's BFI classics, which are more and more broadly defined what a classic is. So I was able to write one on Alfred Hitchcock's Rebecca, which is 1940, so just barely didn't make it to today's discussion. But there's so many really richly illustrated and gossipy, as well as analytically revealing books in that series.
Nice. Sounds awesome. All right, y'all. Thanks so much for listening to Feminist Frequency Radio. Our show is engineered by Rob Para. Carrie Stimson provides technical support, artwork by Jamie Varon, and our intro music is by Phil Circus. Thanks for listening.
Thanks.